Well, the magic of the 275 GTB-C is the fact that it's really a road car that was turned into a competition car. And that was after Ferrari had their wrist slap for their 65 version of the homologated car. The ultimate cheater house car, the 275 Comp Speciale that won the GT class in 65. The 250 LM won overall in 65, making it a 1-2 sweep for Ferrari. But the FIA said, listen, in 66, don't bother bringing that car back. It was so cheated up. So they had to have a more subtle version, and that's what this is here. There's 101 differences, but when you really look at the car, it doesn't look that different. That's until you drive it. Of course, they've done a whole bunch of stuff to make the car lighter, and we'll go over all of those trick little things. But they've also made the car faster. They've got a great handling car. They used a 3.3 liter, making well over 300 horsepower. The fact that it's got a 3 carb is actually a mistake on Ferrari's part. Of course, they had the 6 carb version that they could have homologated, but they actually forgot to put it in on the paperwork. So they ended up having to run all of these cars with a 3 carb. To get around that, they did a 46 size carburetor instead of a 40. Made a wonderful sounding car, but it also gave it that cool laid-back trumpet look on the carburetors. They also upgraded the compression, had bigger valves, sodium-filled valves. The cars rev beautifully. There's nothing like the sound of a 3.3 liter at 7,500 RPM. This car sounds great at full song. What a great sounding car and just a pleasure to drive. I'd love to have this one out on the racetrack. But what's cool is this car is just as much at home on the street as it is on the racetrack. It really is a GT car, and it is a great car that won Le Mans again in 66 and 67. A testament how well these cars work and how reliable the cars were. There were 12 long-nose GTB-Cs, this one being 09067. And what a wonderful history in the sense that even though it didn't do a whole bunch of racing, the car had a virgin body when it was restored. The original motor, the original transaxle, and the original chassis. Extremely rare on these cars that had so much racing going on. And boy, did they ever perform. But it was 101 little things that made these cars really unique. So let me go over all the differences, what makes this 275 so special. So again, Ferrari had to make everything extremely subtle, and they did. So let's start at the front. The bumpers were mounted directly to the body. The alloy body is 50% thinner than a regular alloy car. The way you can tell if it's an alloy car is you can look at the seams here in the roof. All alloy cars, even the GTB-Cs, had this and this here for the seams. And in here, you can see the difference as well in the vents. That would be smoothed over. There would be no line here. But what made these cars different is, again, they're 50% thinner, and the rockers on these cars are even aluminum. On the regular alloy cars, they're steel. So when you open and close a door on an aluminum car, you don't want to keep pushing by the door handle. You're better to just give it a slam rather than just pushing it, because you will dent these cars. Of course, they came with the outside laced wheels. They came with the competition wheels, both in outside laced wires or also with the alloy wheels. The wheel well's also a different shape. It's kind of bulged out or flared out to give room for that bigger tire that they needed. As we go around to the back, you can see the trim is a little bit different on these cars. Both the front and rear window, they have aluminum trim instead of brass with chrome plating. Again, saving a little bit of weight. They continued that theme in the trunk. So in the trunk, instead of having a square tube frame, they had this little tiny thin tube frame. They had no clasp, they just had this little prop rod here. And then when you look inside, it's very different. It's got the oversized fuel tanks, again with the crossover down in the middle. But what was also unique is they had to move the spare tire into the front to make room for the oversized fuel tanks. They also had fiberglass inner wheel wells. They had a fiberglass floor used extensively, again, to lighten up the car. Although the suspension was basically the same as the 275 GTB, all of the components were tweaked. Everything that they could lighten, they lightened up on. They also made everything a little bit stronger. Chassis was reinforced. As far as the interior goes, it looks basically like a stock 275 GTB interior. Other than the steering wheel, most of them came with the leather wrapped wheel. Some had the holes drilled in it, some did not. If you want to go to the extreme, lighten everything, drill it out. The upholstery, very different too. This is the original style material, almost impossible to get. Weight savings, and then there's very little sound deadening on these cars. They even went to the extreme. If you look inside at the door hinges, they drilled out the door hinges. They were trying to save ounces. As far as the outside of the body goes, there's only one telltale sign that the motor had something special. It had a dry sump, had this little trap door here where you'd fill up the oil tank. The rest of the car, again, looks pretty much stock. That is until you open the hood. The first thing you have to be careful of when you open the hood, it is extremely flimsy. The reason it's so flimsy, again, the frame was just drilled out. You can see it just wiggling. And again, super thin aluminum on the car, so you have to be careful. Even how they spot welded the inner engine bay panels, it's unique. It's again there to lighten everything. The other thing you notice is, see how far the motor's set down? To get the CG way down, they set the motor down in the chassis. And the chassis is unique to a 275 GTBC. The first couple cars that were actually Classique, they struggled to understand why they looked different. They finally figured out the GTBCs had a little bit different chassis, reinforced, made a little bit stronger, motor stuck down. Some of the things with a late serial number like this car here, 9067, they would have had by that time a torque tube. This car doesn't have a torque tube. They didn't want it. It just has an interim drive shaft with a U-joint. They wanted that for racing. The first thing that you notice is these air horns. Most of the 275 GTBs that you see are displayed like this, just with these air horns. But what a lot of people don't realize is these air horns were inside an air cleaner. That air cleaner was taller than a standard one, and the reason these are bent back and have this beautiful shape is actually to fit inside. Otherwise, they would have been straight up. The other thing that you see here is this green, looks like garden hose. Well, this here is a venting system that goes into the catch tank. Again, if you're running 24 hours like these cars did, you needed a way to capture all that so it's not going on the track or onto the tires. It's an interesting look. In the front, you have an oil cooler that runs the full length of the radiator. Like I said, there's 101 trick components, but Ferrari had to be subtle. And that's what makes this car so cool. It's one of the most subtle, one of the winningest race cars you'll ever see, winning its class at Le Mans in 66 and 67 again, but you could drive this car every day on the street. Makes a great touring car for Tour Auto or any of the events around the world. In 2017, Mark Allen of Rare Drive did a complete ground-up restoration. Every detail is correct. He does a tremendous amount of research, but he told me, he said when he started with this car, it was one of the nicest bodied old Ferraris he had ever done. He's one of the most knowledgeable guys in these cars. He does spectacular work. The bones of this car were excellent. The car had never had any damage. It had its original motor. It was completely rebuilt mechanically as well as cosmetically. The car got its Red Book certification. The car won platinum at the Ferrari Nationals. This car here is as good as it gets. It's one of the 12 Series 2 cars, and because of that, it makes it a super special car. A third as rare as the GTO, won Le Mans 3 times instead of 2 times. I think they're underappreciated, and they have nowhere to go but up.